I was 36 years old when I found the letter that destroyed everything I thought I knew about my family. It was yellowed and brittle, hidden between the pages of my grandmother's Bible, a place sacred enough that no one would dare disturb it, yet accessible enough to be found by the right person at the right time. That person apparently was me. My name is Eleanor Winters, and until that rainy Tuesday afternoon in April, I was the chief archivist at the Westbrook Historical Society, a position I had held with quiet pride for nearly a decade. My job was to preserve the stories of others, to catalog and protect the fragments of lives long past. I never expected to uncover a secret that would rewrite my own history. Eleanor, are you still here? Martin's voice echoed through the empty museum halls. As the director, he was accustomed to finding me working late, surrounded by documents long after everyone else had gone home. In the storage room, I called back, carefully placing my grandmother's Bible into an acid-free box. I had brought it in to properly preserve it after finding it while clearing out her house. She had passed away 3 months earlier at 92, leaving me as the last of the Winters line. Or so I had believed. Martin appeared in the doorway, his bow tie slightly askew as always. It's almost 8. Even dedicated archivists need to eat dinner. I held up the letter, my hand trembling slightly. I found something. In my grandmother's Bible. Family recipe? Secret romance? He smiled, then noticed my expression. Eleanor, what is it? A letter from my grandmother to someone named Clara Bennett, dated June 4, 1956. I swallowed hard. It's about a baby, my mother, I think. Except what? Except my grandmother wasn't supposed to have given birth to my mother. She adopted her. That's what I've been told my entire life. I looked up at Martin, the museum's dim emergency lights casting shadows across his concerned face. This letter suggests otherwise. It says, the baby is healthy and beautiful. No one will ever know she isn't Lawrence's. Your sacrifice has saved us all. Martin pulled up a chair beside me. Are you saying? I'm saying my grandmother had an affair, got pregnant, and then convinced her best friend to pretend the baby, my mother, was hers. Then she and my grandfather adopted their own biological grandchild and raised her as their daughter. The words sounded absurd as I said them, like the plot of a melodramatic novel rather than my family history. That's quite a revelation, Martin said carefully. What will you do? I folded the letter along its well-worn creases. What I always do. Research. There's more to this story, and if there's one thing I know how to do, it's follow a historical paper trail. I didn't sleep that night. Instead, I spread my grandmother's papers across my dining room table. Birth certificates, marriage licenses, photographs, journals, all the materials I had collected after her death but had been too grief-stricken to properly examine. With trained eyes, I began to see the inconsistencies I had missed before. Dates that didn't quite align, unexplained gaps in correspondence, photographs where my grandmother's smile seemed forced. By morning, I had formulated a hypothesis and a research plan. If Clara Bennett had pretended to be pregnant while my grandmother actually was, there would be records, doctor's visits, hospital stays, perhaps even newspaper announcements. And if Clara had then given her baby to my grandparents to raise, there would be adoption papers. For the first time in my career, I called in sick to the museum. This was personal research that couldn't wait. The county records office was housed in a brutalist concrete building that always reminded me of a mausoleum, fitting perhaps for an institution that preserved the official documentation of lives no longer lived. I knew the clerk well, having spent countless hours researching local families for museum exhibits. Birth records for Clara Bennett, he repeated, peering at me over his glasses. That's going back a ways, and it's not related to a museum project. Family research, I said, the half-truth bitter on my tongue. My grandmother mentioned a Clara Bennett as an old friend. I'm trying to piece together some family history. 3 hours later, I had my answer, or at least part of it. There was no record of Clara Bennett giving birth in 1956. There was, however, a marriage certificate for Clara Bennett and George Carter dated 1955, and a death certificate for Clara Carter dated December 1956, cause of death, hemorrhage following childbirth. My hands shook as I requested the birth certificate for the Carter baby. When it arrived, the name listed was simply Baby Girl Carter, with no first name recorded. Father, George Carter. Mother, Clara Carter, née Bennett. Was the baby adopted? I asked the clerk. Would those records be available? He shook his head. Adoption records from that era are sealed unless you're directly involved. You'd need a court order or consent from the adoptee. I thanked him and left, my mind racing. If Clara had died in childbirth, she couldn't have been the woman who pretended to be pregnant with my mother. And if there was no record of my grandmother giving birth that year, the next logical step was to find George Carter. It took 2 weeks of determined research, but I finally located him in a retirement community 50 miles away. At 89, George Carter was still sharp-minded, though his body was frail. When I called to request a meeting, explaining only that I was researching Clara Bennett's family connections, he agreed immediately. Not many people remember Clara anymore, he said, his voice wavering over the phone. I'd be happy to talk about her. The retirement community was pleasant, with wide hallways and abundant natural light. George waited for me in a common area, a photo album open on the table before him. He was thin and stooped, with liver-spotted hands and clear blue eyes that reminded me, with a jolt, of my own. Mr. Carter, I began after we'd exchanged pleasantries. Thank you for meeting with me. As I mentioned, I'm researching Clara Bennett, your first wife. Clara, he said softly, touching a black and white photograph of a smiling young woman with dark hair. The love of my life, even after all these years. I understand she died in childbirth, I said gently. I'm very sorry. He nodded, grief still evident in his expression decades later. It was sudden. Complications no one expected. One moment we were celebrating the birth of our daughter, and the next. He trailed off, then regained his composure. But you didn't come here to listen to an old man's sorrows. What do you want to know about Clara? I hesitated, uncertain how to broach the subject delicately. I'm interested in what happened to your daughter. His expression changed, becoming guarded. Why would you be asking about that? I took a deep breath and placed my grandmother's letter on the table between us. Because I found this. It was written by my grandmother, Margaret Winters, to Clara. It suggests some sort of arrangement involving a baby. George stared at the letter for a long moment, then looked up at me, really seeing me for the first time. You have her eyes, he said quietly. Clara's eyes. What are you saying? I whispered, though I already knew. Margaret and Clara were best friends since childhood, he began, closing the photo album. When Clara found out she was expecting, Margaret was the first person she told. They shared everything. He paused, collecting his thoughts. Around the same time, Margaret discovered she was pregnant too. The timing was significant. Because the baby wasn't her husband's, I supplied. George nodded. Lawrence Winters was overseas with the military. Margaret had formed an attachment with someone else. When Lawrence returned unexpectedly, she knew her indiscretion would be discovered once the baby arrived. The timing wouldn't work. So what happened? I pressed, though the outline of the story was becoming horrifyingly clear. Clara offered a solution. She would claim to be carrying twins. When the babies were born, she would keep one as her own, and Margaret would adopt the other, her biological child, claiming it was Clara's baby that they had adopted out of friendship after Clara found herself with 2 infants and a modest income. But Clara died, I said. Yes. His voice cracked. And in the confusion and grief that followed, Margaret took both babies, her own, as planned, and Clara's daughter as well. She and Lawrence adopted them both as supposed twins. They named them Rose and Elizabeth. The names hit me like a physical blow. Rose was my mother. Elizabeth was her twin sister, who had died in a car accident when they were 19, long before I was born. So my mother and her sister weren't actually twins. They weren't even related. No, George said. Rose was Margaret's biological daughter. Elizabeth was mine and Clara's. Did they know, my mother and Elizabeth? No, Margaret and Lawrence raised them as their own, as twins, as sisters in every way that mattered. Margaret always intended to tell them when they were old enough. But then Elizabeth died so young, and after that, he spread his hands. Margaret thought it would only cause pain to reveal the truth. And you? I couldn't keep the accusation from my voice. You just let my grandparents take your daughter. Pain flickered across his weathered face. I was shattered by Clara's death. I couldn't care for a newborn alone. Margaret promised to give Elizabeth a good home, to love her as her own. She swore I could be part of her life, and I was, as Uncle George, the family friend who sent birthday cards and Christmas gifts. Did my grandfather know? Lawrence? George shook his head. No. Margaret maintained the fiction that both girls were Clara's, and that they had adopted them after her death. Lawrence never questioned it. I sat back, trying to absorb everything. So my mother wasn't actually a Winters at all. No, George agreed. Biologically, Rose, your mother, was Margaret's child with a man named James Caldwell. He never knew about the pregnancy. He moved away, married someone else. Is he still alive? No, he died about 15 years ago. I nodded, feeling strangely numb. And Elizabeth, she was your daughter. My mother's twin was actually your child. Yes. George reached into his pocket and withdrew a worn photograph, handing it to me. It showed two teenage girls with their arms around each other, laughing at the camera. This is the last picture I have of them together, before Elizabeth's accident. I stared at the photo, at these two girls who had grown up believing they were twin sisters, when one was my biological grandmother's daughter and the other the daughter of the woman sitting across from me. They looked so happy, so unaware of the complex deception that had shaped their very existence. Why are you telling me all this now? I asked. You could have denied everything, claimed the letter was misinterpreted. George smiled sadly. Because you came looking for the truth. Because you have Clara's eyes. Because secrets like this poison families across generations. He reached out and covered my hand with his. And because I'm 89 years old, Eleanor, I've carried this secret for over 60 years. I'm tired. As I drove home, my mind swirled with implications. My mother had died believing she was someone she wasn't. I was not who I thought I was. The Winters name, which I had worn with such pride, wasn't even my biological heritage. At home, I spread the photographs across my dining room table again, seeing them with new eyes. There was my grandmother, Margaret, young and beautiful, her smile not forced but guilty. There was Uncle George, standing at the edge of family gatherings, watching Elizabeth, his daughter, grow up from a distance. There were my mother and her sister, inseparable until death, never knowing they weren't biological sisters at all. And there was me, the archivist, the preserver of stories, who had failed to read the silences and omissions in my own family narrative. 3 days later, I returned to work. Martin found me cataloging a collection of Civil War letters, my white-gloved hands moving with practiced precision. Are you okay? He asked. You seem different. I considered the question carefully. Was I okay? My entire understanding of my family history had been appended. The grandmother I had revered had carried out an elaborate deception. My mother had lived and died never knowing her true parentage, and somewhere in my genes ran the blood of a stranger named James Caldwell, not Lawrence Winters. I'm processing, I said finally. It turns out we're all unreliable narrators of our own histories. Did you find what you were looking for? Martin asked. I found more than I expected, I replied. I found that even the most carefully preserved archives can contain significant gaps. That evening, I drove back to the retirement community. George Carter was waiting for me, a small wooden box on his lap. These belong to Clara, he said, opening it to reveal a pearl necklace, a few letters, and a small diary. I think she would want her granddaughter to have them. Her granddaughter, I repeated, testing the words. Yes, George said firmly. Elizabeth was your aunt in every way that matters, which makes me, he trailed off, suddenly uncertain. Family, I finished for him. Complicated, unexpected family. He smiled, relief evident in his expression. I never thought I'd have the chance to know Clara's family line. After Elizabeth died, I assumed that connection was lost forever. I sat beside him, and together we looked through Clara's belongings. This woman I had never known but whose best friend's secret had altered the course of my family forever. As George told me stories about Clara, her laugh, her love of poetry, her dream of traveling to Paris, I began to see the outlines of a new understanding of family, one that embraced the messy, complicated truth rather than the sanitized fiction my grandmother had created. 2 months later, the Westbrook Historical Society unveiled a new exhibit, Hidden Histories, The Untold Stories of Westbrook Families. Among the displays was a section on the Bennett Carter Winters connection, complete with photographs, letters, and a family tree showing the complex interweaving of these lives. Are you sure about including your own family in the exhibit? Martin had asked when I proposed it. Yes, I had replied. As archivists, we talk about the importance of preserving the past, of ensuring that stories aren't lost. But we rarely acknowledge how selective those preservations can be, how families curate their own narratives, deciding what to remember and what to forget. The night before the exhibit opened, I stood alone in the gallery looking at the photographs of Margaret, Clara, Rose, and Elizabeth, the women whose choices and circumstances had shaped my existence in ways I was only beginning to understand. My grandmother had preserved a fiction she believed was necessary. Perhaps she was right. Perhaps the truth would have caused more pain than healing for my mother and Elizabeth. But as I stood there, surrounded by the evidence of lives complexly lived, I felt a sense of peace settle over me. As an archivist, I had dedicated my life to preserving the stories of others. Now I had uncovered and preserved the complicated truth of my own family. There was a certain symmetry to that, a rightness that transcended the shock and betrayal I had initially felt. George attended the opening of the exhibit, frail but determined, his eyes bright as he saw Clara's photograph displayed prominently, her story finally told. Visitors moved through the exhibit, murmuring about the unexpected connections, the secret adoptions, the hidden pregnancies, all the messy humanity that official records so often fail to capture. Your grandmother would have hated this, George whispered to me, a hint of mischief in his voice. Probably, I agreed. But I think she also would have understood it. She was protecting people she loved. Now I'm honoring them, all of them, by telling their complete story. Later that night, at home, I opened Clara's diary for the first time. Her handwriting was delicate but determined, filling the pages with observations about her daily life, her hopes for her unborn child, her deep friendship with Margaret. On the final page she had written, "Life rarely gives us simple choices. Sometimes the best we can do is to act with love and trust that future generations will understand, even if they cannot forgive." I ran my fingers over the words, this message from a woman I had never known, but whose choices had rippled through time to shape my very existence. Clara couldn't have imagined that 60 years later, her best friend's granddaughter would read these words, seeking understanding for a deception that had defined 3 generations. In my professional life, I had always believed that archives existed to preserve the truth. Now I understood that they preserved a version of the truth, selected, curated, sometimes sanitized. The messy reality of human lives often existed in the spaces between official records, in the silences and omissions in the stories families told themselves. As an archivist, I had failed to read those silences in my own family history, as Eleanor Winters, or was it Eleanor Caldwell, or perhaps Eleanor Carter, in honor of the grandfather I had discovered so late in life. I was learning to listen to them, to hear what remained unsaid, and to find peace in the complicated, imperfect truth. 6 months after discovering my grandmother's letter, I stood beside George Carter's hospital bed, holding his frail hand as he drifted in and out of consciousness. At 90, his body was finally failing him. "Clara," he murmured, his eyes opening slightly. "Clara, I've missed you." "It's Eleanor," I said gently, squeezing his hand. He smiled weakly. "I know, but you have her eyes." As his breathing slowed, I thought about the strange journey that had brought me here, to the bedside of a man who was both a stranger and family, linked to me through a complex web of secrets, choices, and consequences that spanned decades. "Thank you," I whispered as he slipped away, "for helping me find the truth." In the end, I realized that's what archives and families are supposed to do. Preserve what came before so that those who follow can understand their place in the continuing story. My grandmother had tried to rewrite history, believing she was protecting those she loved. But some stories insist on being told, emerging from forgotten Bibles and dusty photographs, demanding acknowledgement. As the newly appointed director of the Westbrook Historical Society, Martin had retired 2 weeks earlier. I had made it my mission to seek out these hidden narratives, to ensure that the archives we maintained reflected the messy, complicated reality of human lives, not just the sanitized versions families often prefer to remember. The last Winters had become the first Carter in 3 generations, and in that transformation, I had found not just a new understanding of my past, but a clearer vision for my future, as an archivist, as a granddaughter, as a keeper of complicated truths. Some might call it betrayal, this public exposure of family secrets. I prefer to think of it as the highest form of remembrance, acknowledging those who came before us not as perfect figures in carefully curated photographs, but as real people who loved, erred, sacrificed, and did their imperfect best to protect what mattered most. In the archive of my own life, that understanding is perhaps the most valuable document of all.